Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome back to the Introduction to Rhetoric. Today, we're going to talk about narrative. Narrative, we have two objectives. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify or to summarize the use of narrative as a rhetorical strategy, and you should be able to identify the parts of narrative. Let's begin to the first Roman numeral. So, storytelling is the key of narrative rhetoric, and it's a very powerful way to convey meaning. It's one maybe that humans use better than any other method. It's an ancient method which crosses a lot of genres. I mean, you think of it as an ancient method, like Jesus spoke in parables. It's a question of storytelling. But we also see storytelling in media, in movies, in television, in the shows we watch. It's in fiction and in nonfiction. All of it counts as narrative. In everyday life, our lives are filled with storytelling. It's the stories that we tell our friends over dinner, the ones we tell at eulogies, during toasts, at job interviews, and on dates, and for those thrilling dinner time conversations. It's used for connecting to an audience. Stories go and help us relate to each other and build community. Good storytelling builds more meaningful connections, and it's crucial in getting your point across. A narrative might be, in use in rhetoric, it might be a commonly known story, like a fable or a historical moment or like a movie plot, something like that everybody knows. And even like little micro references to the narrative clue people in. If somebody says, "May the Force be with you," like you have the whole, saga of the Star Wars just comes out of that part. And it's a commonly known movie plot that even people who aren't like Star Wars people kind of know the biggest plots of it. But commonly known stories aren't actually widely used in modern rhetoric all that much because people already know the plot, unless maybe the rhetor is telling that story with some important changes to it. Like if a fairy tale is retold with the damsel in distress as like the protagonist of the story, storytelling becomes rhetoric because it adapts the narrative to highlight the inequality or self-determination of that damsel in distress. So we don't usually see a lot of like that kind of stuff show up in modern rhetoric, but it can, and when it does, it's usually done kind of for a particular reason. We might find that storytelling and rhetoric uses a lesser known story, but maybe a notable one. For instance, in 2015, when the musical Hamilton debuted, Alexander Hamilton was a mostly forgotten figure in American history. He was the forgotten founding father. But the Hamilton musical adapted his story with this like all minority cast, and it spoke about power structures and among other topics to it. And now Alexander Hamilton's one of the more popular founding fathers, just in a decade's worth of time. Some rhetors use fiction to go illustrate their points. Now, I'm going to say that using fiction in your rhetoric is usually more effective in things like artistic media, film and TVs and movies and novels and stuff like that, than it is in other uses onto it, like in traditional speeches. But narrative is usually a first-person account. And how is narrative actually used? Narrative is usually a first-person account where somebody is telling their own story to somebody else. So the rhetor is telling his or her own story to persuade the audience. And personal storytelling is extremely effective because the audience has to put a face and a voice to the issue. It's not abstract. It relates to the person exactly in front of them. There are multiple appeals that goes on in storytelling. This is our subpoint B. Narrative might be used for ethos, establishing credibility of the rhetor. If the rhetor isn't well known to the audience, then storytelling might be used to go establish the speaker as an authority on the subject, somebody that has been there and dealt with the things before. Narrative is also extremely powerful in developing pathos. Pathos is the emotional appeal. Now, people who could tell endearing stories can make an audience feel very good about supporting a point because they begin to connect a person with the cause to it. Sad stories bring out sympathy or guilt, and funny stories can make an audience abandon their preconceptions and consider other people's points of view. So point C, let's talk about how narrative is used. A narrative might be an entire work of rhetoric with a main point. Consider like rhetorical novels like Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harry Beecher Stowe. Uncle Tom's Cabin is this powerful anti-slavery book about bondage and freedom. And the book was so moving that Abraham Lincoln quipped to the author that she started the entire Civil War. Or you think of Corrie ten Boom's memoirs, The Hiding Place, and her family's work to go help Jewish people escape Nazi persecution. It's a long story, a long true story piece of rhetoric about how heroic love can triumph and doggedly resisting evil to it. Narrative might be a personal story that fits a larger theme to it, such as a person talking about getting cut from their youth baseball team to talk about rebounding from failure, or, getting cut from the team probably isn't the main part of the speech, but it's an important part of the rhetoric, and their narrative takes something that can be greatly used. Many speakers use micro narratives, little small compact stories, or stories that compact the plot into just a few sentences. Now, these are kind of similar to enthymemes. They typically automatically draw on audience knowledge or expectations to go fill in the plot details that the rhetor just kind of hints at. Micronarratives, honestly, it's not very effective for a lot of people. The people that can do it, man, micronarrative can be really awesome at it. Subpoint D. Let's talk about the functions of narrative rhetoric. So it does a few things. First, it adds an interest to the material. Like, people just like to hear stories. They like to know that there's some way that they could imagine how people live in the situation or deal with it firsthand. It creates interest. Just stories are interesting. It also creates an identification between the characters and the audience. Once you have a connection between the narrator and the audience, the rhetor and the audience, and the characters and the audience, it allows the rhetor to create empathy and build connections there on an emotional level. It also gives examples to support or deny rational argument. You remember like rational argument uses claims and evidence and reasoning, claims, evidence, and warrants to it to prove its point. Well, an anecdote is considered evidence. Now, it's considered like the weakest part of evidence, but it is a type of evidence onto it, and it can be used, but also like people can think something rationally, but hear a story and like suddenly take a new perspective onto it, or even change their point of view onto it. So narrative could create an emotional response. It can also, especially for pity or for guilt, which aren't always good, but pity and guilt can be used for good purposes, and they can be a valid rhetorical approach. Also, first-person storytelling in particular can break down barriers to understanding. Stories make us laugh, and they make us feel hope, and they make us feel like it's going to be okay, like we're less alone in that moment, and storytelling becomes super powerful, and narrative a super important tool for a rhetor to do that. Let's go to our next Roman numeral, and let's talk about what the parts are to composition. And some of this is going to sound a lot like English class, because the parts in English class are also kind of the parts we use in rhetoric. That narrative has to have some parts to it. The most important part is that there needs to be a plot. Narrative needs a storyline to go tell what happens. If it doesn't have a plot, it's not narrative. And a plot has several parts to it. There's a rising action, all the stuff on the way to the conflict. And then there's an actual conflict. And conflicts could be, your classic person versus person, or it could be, person versus self trying to overcome something in their lives. Or it could be person versus nature or the supernatural, or person versus technology, or person versus society, like big part. But there needs to be some kind of a conflict. It needs to be pretty recognizable to the audience what's going on to it. But there needs to also be a climax. Like the conflict needs to reach a climactic point and resolution. The conflict needs to reach a high point and be resolved for it to be actual working narrative. Now, I'll also say that there are some types of narrative where the conflict is not actually resolved. But in that case, the irresolution, the unsolved part of it, also needs to be part of the narrative. Like that needs to be like the rhetoric, the ongoing struggle of the topic, something like that. Good narrative has a resolution to it, but we live in real life, and sometimes real life is messier than that. Then the irresolution needs to be part of the story as well. And there needs to be a falling action also. This may be very short, but you need to end the story. You need to end the narrative to it. You don't just leave it in the climax. Also, there needs to be a scene. So you've got a plot, you also need a scene. And sometimes these are super complicated. Sometimes they're pretty simple, but it needs to be set in a time and a place where the story actually occurs to it. And in rhetoric, this may be very important. It may be very small, but storytelling like in a setting in a modern hospital looks entirely different than a setting in a medieval hospital. They can be both narrative storytelling, and they can both be really important, but stories take place in time and space. So set them in there as well. There also needs to be characters. Now, when you're considering using narrative storytelling in your rhetoric, I want you to go focus on the protagonist, the person that the main character, and the antagonist, the thing that the main character is working against, or the person that the main character is working against. The rhetor, him or herself, may be either one. They may be the protagonist or the antagonist. The protagonist is the main figure. It's one of the most prominent figures in the situation. And usually the main character is the protagonist. Like the story, if you're doing personal storytelling, you're probably the protagonist in the story. I can imagine a scenario where you're the antagonist, but conventionally you're the protagonist. But the antagonist is the person who opposes or is hostile to something. They're an adversary. They're the opponent in the story. The op is the antagonist. And then lastly, they need to have a theme to it. Subpoint D, the theme. What's the point of the story? Now, this is very important for rhetoric because the storytelling has to go fit the person that you're wanting to tell. The goal that you're trying to reach with them. It may or may not be important in general media. Like if you're just watching your show, you're just streaming and you're binge watching your show. There may be a theme to it that's like some classical big noble theme. There may not be. Like it might just be an episode of Friends. Like there might not be much to it, but there could be some theme to it. All right, so that is narrative storytelling. It's very important in rhetoric. It's going to be one of the expectations that we have for you when you are writing your persuasive speech, that you could tell some story about it. That's all we got. Thank you. God bless you. Go Thunder.